John Wayne Gacy was a depraved serial killer who, between 1972 and 1978, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in the Chicago area, burying 26 of their bodies in the crawl space beneath his suburban home while disposing of the remaining victims in the Des Plaines River, all while maintaining a public persona as a successful businessman and beloved community entertainer known as Pogo the Clown. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins on March 17, 1942, in the sterile confines of Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. Born into what appeared to be an ordinary working-class family, John Wayne Gacy Jr. entered the world as the second of 3 children and the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. His father, a World War I veteran, worked as an auto repair machinist, while his mother devoted herself to homemaking duties. The family claimed both Polish and Danish ancestry and practiced the Catholic faith, presenting an outward appearance of typical American respectability that would later serve as a cruel contrast to the horrors that would unfold. From his earliest years, young John Wayne found himself trapped in an atmosphere of domestic terror that would profoundly shape the monster he would become. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a violent alcoholic whose demons manifested in brutal attacks upon his family. After completing his shifts on the assembly line, the elder Gacy would descend into the basement of their home, where he would consume brandy in solitude before emerging to terrorize his wife and children at the dinner table. The family would sit in fearful silence, waiting for his drunken ascent from the basement, never knowing what violence might follow. The abuse John Wayne endured at the hands of his father was both physical and psychological, leaving scars that would never heal. John Stanley Gacy wielded a razor strap as his weapon of choice, delivering savage beatings to his children for the slightest infractions. But perhaps more damaging than the physical violence were the constant verbal assaults that attacked the very core of John Wayne's developing identity. His father routinely called him dumb and stupid, comparing him unfavorably to his 2 sisters and questioning his masculinity with cruel taunts. The elder Gacy would call his son a sissy and a mama's boy, predicting with disturbing prescience that he would probably grow up queer. One of John Wayne's earliest childhood memories would remain seared in his consciousness throughout his life: the brutal beating he received at age 4 for accidentally disarranging car engine components in his father's workshop. The violence of that assault, administered to such a young child for such an innocent mistake, established a pattern of fear and resentment that would fester for decades. John Wayne learned to endure these beatings without crying, developing a stoic exterior that masked the rage and pain building within him. Sometimes his refusal to show tears would only anger his father further, leading to even more savage attacks. The boy's relationship with his mother provided his only source of comfort in the hellish household. Marion Gacy attempted to shield her son from his father's abuse, but her protective instincts only served to fuel John Stanley's fury. He accused his wife of coddling the boy, claiming that her maternal protection would turn him into a weakling. The elder Gacy's homophobia was virulent and constant, poisoning every interaction with his son and creating an atmosphere where young John Wayne learned to fear and hide any perceived weakness. Adding to the family's dysfunction was a dark secret that John Wayne would carry alone for years. In 1949, when the boy was 7 years old, a family friend began sexually molesting him. These encounters continued periodically, but John Wayne never told his father about the abuse, terrified that he would be blamed for what was happening to him. Given his father's violent tendencies and homophobic attitudes, the boy's fear was entirely rational. He understood, even at such a young age, that revealing this secret could result in consequences even worse than the abuse itself. John Wayne's physical health problems further complicated his childhood and provided additional ammunition for his father's cruelty. As an overweight and unathletic child, he was already marked as different from his peers. A congenital heart condition prevented him from participating in sports, depriving him of opportunities to prove his physical prowess or gain acceptance from other boys. His father showed no sympathy for this medical condition, instead viewing it as yet another failure and weakness to be ridiculed. Beginning in the 4th grade, John Wayne started experiencing mysterious blackouts that would plague him throughout his adolescence. These episodes resulted in frequent hospitalizations, and by his own estimation, He spent nearly a year in various hospitals between the ages of 14 and 18. The medical community was unable to conclusively diagnose the cause of these blackouts, leading his father to suspect that his son was malingering, faking illness to avoid responsibilities and gain attention. On one particularly cruel occasion, John Stanley openly accused his son of pretending to be sick while the boy lay in a hospital bed, adding humiliation to his physical suffering. These frequent absences from school due to his medical condition caused John Wayne's grades to suffer significantly. The combination of missed classes, ongoing abuse at home, and social isolation created a perfect storm of academic failure and psychological damage. He struggled to maintain friendships or find his place among his peers, becoming increasingly withdrawn and resentful. The constant cycle of illness, hospitalization, and accusations of fakery created a deep sense of alienation that would persist throughout his life. In 1957, John Wayne faced another medical crisis when his appendix burst, requiring emergency surgery and extended recovery time. Even this legitimate medical emergency failed to generate sympathy from his father, who continued to view any sign of physical weakness as evidence of his son's fundamental inadequacy. The boy was caught in an impossible situation, genuinely suffering from medical conditions while being accused of fabricating his symptoms for attention. As John Wayne entered adolescence, his relationship with his father became even more strained and violent. The teenager began to show signs of the behavioral problems that would later manifest in far more dangerous ways. His father's abuse had taught him that violence was an acceptable response to frustration and that manipulation could be used to avoid consequences. At the same time, he was learning to present a false persona to the outside world, hiding his anger and pain behind a mask of normalcy. The young man's first serious brush with authority and his developing pattern of deception occurred during his high school years. Despite his academic struggles, John Wayne possessed a certain charisma and ability to charm adults when it served his purposes. However, his underlying anger and sense of entitlement were never far from the surface. He began experimenting with petty crimes and manipulative behavior, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. His father's prediction about his sexuality would prove to have a grain of truth, though not in the way John Stanley intended. As John Wayne matured, he began to recognize his attraction to other males, a realization that filled him with terror given his father's violent homophobia. This internal conflict between his emerging sexual identity and his desperate need for paternal approval created additional psychological pressure that would contribute to his later development as a predator. The pattern of abuse, neglect, and psychological damage that characterized John Wayne's childhood created the foundation for the monster he would become. The violence he witnessed and experienced taught him that other people existed primarily to be used and discarded. His father's constant criticism and impossible standards convinced him that he was fundamentally flawed, while simultaneously nurturing a narcissistic need to prove his worth through dominance over others. The sexual abuse he suffered normalized the concept of using weaker individuals for personal gratification, while his father's homophobia created a twisted association between sexual violence and masculinity. As John Wayne approached adulthood, the toxic combination of childhood trauma, untreated mental illness, and learned patterns of violence had created a dangerous individual. The blackouts that had plagued his youth may have been early indicators of neurological damage, possibly caused by the head injury he suffered at age 11 when he was struck by a swing. The medical community's failure to properly diagnose and treat his condition meant that any organic factors contributing to his psychological problems went unaddressed. The sexual abuse he endured as a child had profound implications for his later crimes. Research has consistently shown that many serial killers were themselves victims of sexual abuse during their formative years, and John Wayne's case fits this pattern perfectly. The powerlessness he felt as a victim would later be transformed into a compulsive need to victimize others, recreating the dynamic of his childhood trauma with himself in the dominant position. His father's relentless questioning of his masculinity created a deep-seated insecurity about his sexual identity that would manifest in his later choice of victims. By targeting young men and boys, John Wayne would be simultaneously expressing his sexual desires and attempting to destroy the perceived source of his shame. The violence and torture that characterized his crimes can be understood as manifestations of the rage he felt toward his father, displaced onto victims who reminded him of his younger, vulnerable self. The failure of authority figures throughout his childhood to protect him from abuse also contributed to his later contempt for social norms and institutions. Teachers who ignored the signs of his distress, medical professionals who dismissed his symptoms, and a society that turned a blind eye to domestic violence all taught him that the strong prey upon the weak without consequence. This lesson would guide his actions throughout his criminal career. As John Wayne entered young adulthood, the foundation for his future crimes was already firmly established. The boy who had been beaten, molested, and psychologically tormented would grow into a man capable of inflicting unimaginable suffering on others. The cycle of violence that began in his childhood home would soon spread far beyond the walls of 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, leaving a trail of broken bodies and shattered families in its wake. The transformation from victim to victimizer was not immediate, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over years of increasingly antisocial behavior. The teenage John Wayne began to experiment with manipulation and deception, skills that would serve him well in his later criminal career. He learned to present different faces to different people, a survival mechanism that had developed in response to his unpredictable and violent home environment. His academic performance continued to suffer as his psychological problems intensified. The bright child who had once shown promise became a surly teenager with little interest in conventional achievement. His frequent absences due to health problems provided convenient excuses for his declining grades, but the underlying cause was his growing alienation from society and its expectations. The social isolation that had characterized his childhood became even more pronounced during his teenage years. While other young people were forming romantic relationships and planning their futures, John Wayne remained trapped in a cycle of medical problems, family violence, and psychological disturbance. His few attempts at normal teenage socializing were hampered by his weight problems, health issues, and the dark secrets he carried about his home life. His father's abuse continued unabated throughout these years, with John Stanley showing no recognition of the damage he was inflicting on his son. The elder Gacy's alcoholism worsened with time, making him even more unpredictable and violent. The family dynamics that had been established during John Wayne's early childhood remained frozen in place, with no one willing or able to break the cycle of violence and dysfunction. The sexual identity crisis that would later play such a crucial role in his crimes began to intensify during adolescence. John Wayne's attraction to other males conflicted sharply with his father's virulent homophobia and the Catholic teachings that had shaped his early moral development. This internal conflict created additional psychological pressure that manifested in increasingly antisocial behavior. His first serious criminal act occurred during this period, though the details remain somewhat obscured by time and John Wayne's later tendency to lie about his past. What is clear is that he began to show the manipulative and predatory behaviors that would characterize his later crimes. These early incidents may have involved inappropriate sexual contact with younger boys, establishing a pattern that would escalate dramatically in the years to come. The failure of the educational system to address his needs represents another missed opportunity for intervention. Teachers and administrators who might have recognized the warning signs of his deteriorating mental health instead focused solely on his academic deficiencies. The behavioral problems that should have triggered psychological evaluation were instead attributed to his medical condition or family circumstances, allowing his dangerous tendencies to develop unchecked. As John Wayne approached the end of his high school years, it became increasingly clear that he was not going to follow a conventional path to adulthood. His academic failures made college unlikely, and his health problems limited his employment options. More importantly, the psychological damage that had been accumulating throughout his childhood was beginning to manifest in ways that posed a serious threat to others. The boy who had once been a victim of sexual abuse was already showing signs that he might become a perpetrator himself. The violence he had witnessed and experienced at home had taught him that physical force was an acceptable means of achieving his goals. The manipulation and deception he had learned as survival mechanisms were evolving into tools for exploitation and predation. His relationship with his father remained poisonously dysfunctional, characterized by mutual contempt and barely suppressed violence. John Stanley's continued abuse and criticism had created in his son a deep-seated hatred that would eventually find expression in his choice of victims. Many of the young men and boys who would later die at John Wayne's hands would bear a psychological resemblance to the vulnerable child he had once been. The religious instruction he had received throughout his childhood had failed to provide any meaningful moral foundation, instead being overshadowed by the violence and dysfunction of his home environment. The Catholic concepts of sin, guilt, and redemption became twisted in his developing psyche, contributing to the complex relationship between sexuality, violence, and power that would characterize his later crimes. As he prepared to leave high school without graduating, John Wayne Gacy was already a deeply disturbed individual with a history of victimization that had shaped him into a potential perpetrator. The next phase of his life would see the gradual emergence of the predatory behaviors that had been incubating during his traumatic childhood and adolescence. The foundation for one of America's most prolific serial killers had been laid, and the countdown to his first murder had begun. The transition from adolescence to young adulthood marked a crucial period in John Wayne Gacy's development as a predator. Having failed to graduate from high school, he found himself at loose ends, without clear direction or purpose. His father's constant criticism had convinced him that he was a failure, while simultaneously nurturing a grandiose self-image that demanded validation and recognition. This contradictory self-perception would drive much of his future behavior, including his later political involvement and community activities. In 1960, at age 18, John Wayne made his first foray into politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party candidate. This early political involvement represented more than mere civic engagement. It was an attempt to gain the respect and recognition that had been denied to him throughout his childhood. Politics offered him a platform for his considerable charisma and manipulative abilities, while providing a veneer of respectability that would serve him well in his later criminal career. His father's reaction to his son's political activities was predictably negative. John Stanley dismissed his son's involvement in Democratic politics, calling him a patsy and heaping additional ridicule upon him. This criticism only reinforced John Wayne's determination to prove himself through political success, setting the stage for a lifelong pattern of using public acclaim to mask private depravity. The same year brought a significant development in John Wayne's relationship with his father, when the elder Gacy purchased a car for his son. However, even this seemingly generous gesture was corrupted by the dysfunctional family dynamics. John Stanley kept the vehicle's title in his own name and used the threat of confiscating the keys as a means of control. This arrangement perfectly encapsulated their relationship, apparent generosity masking manipulation and control. The breaking point came in April 1962 when John Wayne, now 20 years old, purchased an extra set of keys for the car without his father's permission. John Stanley's response was swift and typical. He removed the distributor cap and kept it for 3 days, rendering the vehicle inoperable. This petty act of control represented one humiliation too many for the young man, and hours after his father replaced the cap, John Wayne made a decision that would mark the beginning of his journey toward independence and, ultimately, toward murder. With only $136 to his name, John Wayne left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada, hoping to stay with a cousin and start a new life away from his father's abuse. This impulsive flight to Las Vegas represented both an escape from his traumatic past and an early indication of the reckless decision-making that would characterize his adult life. The young man who arrived in Las Vegas was damaged, angry, and increasingly dangerous, though his most violent impulses had not yet fully manifested. In Las Vegas, John Wayne found work with the ambulance service, a job that exposed him to death and human suffering on a regular basis. This early exposure to mortality and trauma may have desensitized him to violence and death, contributing to his later ability to kill without apparent remorse. The ambulance service also provided him with knowledge of human anatomy and the process of dying, information that would prove useful in his later criminal career. His time with the ambulance service was brief, and he was soon transferred to Palm Mortuary, where he worked as a mortuary attendant for 3 months. This job placed him in direct contact with corpses, allowing him to observe the embalming process and occasionally serve as a pallbearer. The macabre nature of this work suited his increasingly dark psychology, and he seemed to find a disturbing fascination with the dead bodies under his care. The mortuary job provided John Wayne with practical knowledge about death and decomposition that would later inform his methods of body disposal. He learned about the physical processes of decay and the practical challenges of handling human remains. This knowledge would prove invaluable when he began killing and needed to dispose of bodies without detection. The most significant incident during his time at Palm Mortuary revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance and provided an early indication of his necrophilic tendencies. One evening, while alone in the mortuary, John Wayne climbed into the coffin of a deceased teenage male. He embraced and caressed the corpse, experiencing what he later described as sexual arousal followed by a profound sense of shock at his own actions. This incident represents a crucial moment in John Wayne's psychological development, marking the first time his sexual desires became explicitly connected with death and corpses. The fact that his chosen target was a teenage male also foreshadowed the demographic characteristics of his future victims. The shock he claimed to feel afterward suggests that he retained some awareness of how aberrant his behavior was, but this self-awareness would prove insufficient to prevent his escalating deviance. The necrophilic episode at Palm Mortuary apparently disturbed him enough to prompt his return to Chicago, though it's unclear whether his departure was motivated by genuine remorse or simply fear of being caught. What is certain is that this incident marked a significant escalation in his sexual pathology, crossing a boundary that would make future transgressions easier to justify and execute. Upon his return to Chicago, John Wayne enrolled at Northwestern Business College, demonstrating a pragmatic recognition that he needed legitimate credentials to achieve his goals. His decision to pursue business education reflected his growing ambition and his understanding that financial success would be necessary to gain the respect and power he craved. Despite having failed to complete high school, he managed to graduate from business college in 1963, showing that he possessed both intelligence and determination when properly motivated. His graduation from Northwestern Business College marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one that would see him achieve considerable legitimate success while simultaneously developing the skills and resources necessary for his future crimes. The business training he received provided him with knowledge of accounting, management, and interpersonal relations that would serve him well in both his legal and illegal activities. In 1963, John Wayne took a management trainee position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company, beginning what would become a surprisingly successful business career. The legitimate achievements he would rack up over the next several years stand in stark contrast to the horrific crimes he would eventually commit, demonstrating the complex duality that characterized his personality. His success in the business world would provide him with financial resources, social connections, and a respectable facade that would prove invaluable in his later criminal activities. The following year brought significant professional and personal developments. The Nunn-Bush Shoe Company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois, to work as a salesman, and his performance was evidently satisfactory because he was eventually promoted to department manager. This professional success represented a dramatic improvement over his troubled adolescence and provided him with the validation he had craved since childhood. More importantly for his future development, in March 1964, John Wayne became engaged to Marlon Myers, a co-worker at Nunn-Bush. This engagement marked his first serious romantic relationship with a woman and represented an attempt to construct a conventional adult identity. However, given his established pattern of attraction to males, this relationship was likely motivated more by social expectations and his desire for respectability than by genuine romantic attachment. During his courtship with Marlon, John Wayne joined the local chapter of the JCs, a service organization that would provide him with numerous opportunities for community involvement and social advancement. His participation in the JCs represented more than mere civic engagement. It was a calculated effort to build the kind of public persona that would shield him from scrutiny and suspicion in later years. The year 1964 also saw John Wayne's second homosexual experience, an encounter that would have significant implications for his psychological development. According to his later accounts, a colleague in the JCs plied him with alcohol and performed oral sex on him while he was intoxicated. This incident occurred during the same period as his engagement to Marlon, creating additional internal conflict about his sexual identity. By 1965, John Wayne's professional success had reached new heights when he was promoted to vice president of the Springfield Jaycees and was named the third most outstanding Jaycee in Illinois. These achievements represented exactly the kind of public recognition and respect he had sought throughout his life. However, the psychological damage from his childhood remained unresolved, and his growing success only served to inflate his already grandiose self-image while providing him with greater opportunities for manipulation and exploitation. The combination of business success, community involvement, and romantic engagement created the perfect facade for John Wayne's developing criminal inclinations. He had learned to present himself as a respectable, successful, and community-minded individual, while harboring dark secrets about his sexual desires and violent fantasies. The skills he was developing in sales and management would prove highly effective in luring and manipulating future victims. His relationship with Marlon Myers progressed toward marriage, despite his continuing struggles with his sexual identity. The decision to marry represented both a genuine attempt to conform to social expectations and a calculated effort to establish his heterosexual credentials. The fact that he was simultaneously engaging in homosexual activities suggests that the marriage was, at least in part, a cover for his true sexual preferences. The success he was achieving in Springfield served multiple psychological functions. It provided him with the external validation he had craved since childhood, while also demonstrating his ability to manipulate and deceive others on a large scale. The respect he earned through his business and community activities fed his narcissistic need for admiration, while the skills he was developing would prove invaluable in his later criminal career. However, beneath the surface of his growing success, darker impulses were continuing to develop. The sexual confusion that had characterized his adolescence was evolving into a more dangerous combination of desire and self-hatred. His attraction to males, combined with the homophobic attitudes instilled by his father, created a psychological pressure cooker that would eventually explode in violence and murder. The period from 1960 to 1965 represents a crucial phase in John Wayne Gacy's development, during which he learned to successfully compartmentalize his public and private selves. The respectable businessman and community leader who emerged during these years was carefully constructed to conceal the damaged and dangerous individual beneath. This ability to maintain a convincing facade would become one of his greatest assets as a serial killer, allowing him to operate undetected for years while maintaining the trust and admiration of his community. As he prepared for marriage and continued his ascent in the business world, John Wayne was simultaneously developing the psychological framework that would support his later crimes. The combination of childhood trauma, sexual confusion, narcissistic personality traits, and learned manipulative behaviors was creating a volatile mixture that would soon manifest in violence. The successful young businessman preparing to marry his coworker was already a predator in the making, and the countdown to his first serious criminal act had begun. The marriage between John Wayne Gacy and Marlon Myers took place in 1964, marking what appeared to be a significant step toward conventional adulthood and respectability. The wedding represented the culmination of John Wayne's efforts to construct a normal public identity, complete with professional success, community involvement, and now a traditional family structure. However, this outward normalcy concealed the continuing psychological turmoil that would soon manifest in criminal behavior. Following their marriage, the couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Marlon's father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises. This relocation provided John Wayne with an unprecedented opportunity for professional advancement and financial success. He was placed in charge of managing the KFC restaurants, a position that gave him considerable authority and responsibility while providing him with valuable experience in business operations and personnel management. The move to Waterloo also brought John Wayne into contact with a new community where he could continue his efforts at image construction and social climbing. He threw himself into local civic activities with characteristic enthusiasm, quickly establishing himself as a prominent and respected member of the community. His involvement in various charitable and social organizations served multiple purposes. It satisfied his need for recognition and admiration, provided him with valuable social connections, and created the kind of impeccable public reputation that would later shield him from suspicion. During this period, John Wayne and Marlon's marriage produced 2 children, a son and a daughter, further cementing his image as a conventional family man. The presence of children in the household added another layer of respectability to his public persona, while also providing him with additional opportunities to demonstrate his community spirit through involvement in child-related activities and organizations. His success in managing the KFC franchises exceeded all expectations, demonstrating his considerable business acumen and leadership abilities. Under his management, the restaurants prospered, and he earned a reputation as an effective and innovative operator. This success provided him with financial resources, social status, and professional confidence that would prove invaluable in his later criminal activities. Perhaps most significantly for his future development as a serial killer, John Wayne became deeply involved with the Gacy's organization in Waterloo. This involvement went far beyond casual membership. He immersed himself completely in the organization's activities, quickly rising through the ranks to positions of leadership and responsibility. The Gacy's provided him with an ideal platform for his manipulative abilities and his need for recognition, while also introducing him to a wide network of business and community leaders. The Gacy's organization served multiple functions in John Wayne's psychological development. It satisfied his narcissistic need for admiration and recognition, provided him with opportunities to exercise power and control over others, and allowed him to refine his skills in manipulation and deception. The leadership roles he assumed within the organization required him to be persuasive, charismatic, and trusted, skills that would later prove essential in luring victims to their deaths. His involvement with the Gacy's also exposed him to young men who were seeking mentorship and guidance, creating opportunities for the kind of inappropriate relationships that would later characterize his criminal behavior. While there is no direct evidence that he engaged in criminal activity during his time in Waterloo, the psychological and social frameworks that would support his later crimes were clearly being established during this period. The combination of business success, community leadership, and family responsibilities created an extremely convincing facade of respectability and normalcy. John Wayne had successfully transformed himself from the troubled and abused child of his youth into an apparently successful and admired adult. However, this transformation was largely superficial, concealing rather than resolving the underlying psychological problems that continued to fester beneath the surface. His marriage to Marlon, while successful in providing him with social respectability, failed to address his ongoing sexual confusion and identity issues. The homosexual desires that had surfaced during his adolescence remained unresolved, creating internal tension that would eventually seek expression through violence and domination. The conventional heterosexual relationship he maintained with his wife was likely more performance than genuine emotional connection, serving his need for social acceptance rather than fulfilling any deeper psychological needs. The period in Waterloo also saw the continued development of John Wayne's manipulative abilities and his understanding of how to exploit others' trust and vulnerabilities. His success in business and community leadership required him to be skilled at reading people, understanding their motivations, and knowing how to influence their behavior. These skills would later prove invaluable in identifying and approaching potential victims. However, beneath the surface of his success and respectability, darker impulses were continuing to develop. The sexual pathology that had manifested during his time at Palm Mortuary in Las Vegas had not been resolved but rather suppressed, awaiting the right combination of circumstances to emerge more fully. The power and authority he was accumulating through his business and community activities were feeding his narcissistic tendencies and his sense of entitlement, while the skills he was developing in manipulation and deception were creating the tools he would need for predatory behavior. The first clear indication that John Wayne's facade was beginning to crack came in 1967, when he was 25 years old. At this time, he committed his first known sexual assault, sodomizing a 15-year-old boy who worked for him at one of the KFC restaurants. This incident marked a crucial escalation in his criminal behavior, representing the first time his sexual pathology had resulted in the victimization of another person. The choice of victim was highly significant, revealing several key aspects of John Wayne's psychological makeup. The victim was male, confirming his homosexual orientation despite his marriage to Marlon. The victim was significantly younger than John Wayne, satisfying his need for dominance and control. The victim was also an employee, someone over whom John Wayne had legitimate authority, demonstrating his willingness to exploit power relationships for sexual gratification. When confronted with the accusation of sexual assault, John Wayne initially denied the charges, demonstrating the same pattern of deception and manipulation that had characterized his interactions throughout his adult life. However, when subjected to a polygraph examination, he failed the test, providing clear evidence of his guilt. This failure represented a significant crack in his carefully constructed facade and marked the beginning of his exposure as a predator. Faced with the prospect of having his victim testify against him, John Wayne made a decision that revealed the true depth of his criminal inclinations. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions or seeking help for his obvious psychological problems, he chose to escalate his criminal behavior by attempting to silence his victim through intimidation and violence. He paid someone to assault the boy, hoping to prevent him from testifying at trial. This decision to use violence as a means of avoiding consequences represented a significant escalation in John Wayne's criminal behavior. It demonstrated his willingness to harm others to protect himself, his complete lack of empathy for his victims, and his growing confidence in his ability to manipulate and control others through fear and intimidation. The fact that he was willing to risk additional serious criminal charges to avoid accountability for the original assault reveals the desperation and recklessness that were beginning to characterize his decision-making. Fortunately for the intended victim, the assault attempt failed. The boy managed to escape from his attacker and was able to identify the perpetrator to police, leading to additional charges against John Wayne for witness intimidation and assault. This failure represented a significant setback in his criminal career, exposing him to serious legal consequences and threatening the carefully constructed public image he had spent years building. Following his arrest on these additional charges, John Wayne underwent a psychiatric evaluation that would provide the first official recognition of his dangerous psychological condition. In 1968, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, a condition characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. This diagnosis was highly significant, as it confirmed that his criminal behavior was not merely an isolated incident, but rather the product of a serious and persistent mental disorder. Despite this psychiatric diagnosis, John Wayne was found mentally competent to stand trial, a decision that would have far-reaching implications for both his future and the lives of his eventual victims. Had he been found incompetent and committed for long-term psychiatric treatment, the murders that would follow might have been prevented. Instead, he was allowed to proceed through the criminal justice system as a responsible adult capable of understanding and controlling his actions. The charges against John Wayne were serious and multiple: sodomy of a minor, witness intimidation, and assault. These charges carried the potential for significant prison time and represented a complete collapse of the respectable public image he had spent years constructing. The man who had been a successful businessman, community leader, and family man was now exposed as a sexual predator and violent criminal. In the face of overwhelming evidence and the failed polygraph examination, John Wayne eventually pleaded guilty to the sodomy charge, accepting a 10-year prison sentence. This plea agreement likely spared him from even more serious consequences, as the additional charges of witness intimidation and assault might have resulted in a much longer sentence if prosecuted separately. The collapse of his public image had immediate and devastating consequences for his personal life. Marlon, faced with the undeniable evidence of her husband's criminal behavior and the complete destruction of their family's reputation, filed for divorce. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, and the marriage was officially dissolved in 1969, while John Wayne was still incarcerated. The end of his marriage also meant the end of his relationship with his children, as Marlon took custody and moved away to protect them from the scandal and potential danger posed by their father. John Wayne would have no further contact with his children, losing not only his wife but also his role as a father and any pretense of conventional family life. The loss of his family, his business, and his standing in the community represented a complete collapse of the life John Wayne had spent years building. However, rather than serving as a wake-up call that might have motivated him to seek help for his psychological problems, these losses seemed only to fuel his resentment and his sense that society had wronged him. The attitude he displayed throughout this period was not one of remorse or acceptance of responsibility, but rather one of anger and self-pity. His incarceration at the Iowa State Men's Reformatory, also known as Anamosa State Penitentiary, provided him with his first extended exposure to the criminal justice system and the institutional environment that would later become his final home. The prison experience taught him valuable lessons about surviving in a violent and predatory environment, while also exposing him to other criminals who could serve as both teachers and inspiration for future illegal activities. During his time in prison, John Wayne proved to be a model inmate, demonstrating the same manipulative abilities that had served him well in the business world. He avoided trouble, participated in rehabilitation programs, and presented himself to authorities as a reformed individual who had learned from his mistakes. This performance was convincing enough to earn him early parole consideration, and he was released in June 1970 after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. The early parole represented both a victory for John Wayne's manipulative abilities and a tragic missed opportunity for public safety. Had he served his full sentence, or had the parole board recognized the true danger he posed, many future victims might have been saved. Instead, his convincing performance as a reformed criminal earned him early release and another opportunity to harm innocent people. His parole came with certain conditions and restrictions, but it also provided him with the freedom to begin rebuilding his life and, more ominously, to begin planning his next crimes. The psychological problems that had led to his initial arrest had not been addressed during his brief incarceration, and the fundamental personality disorder that had been diagnosed remained untreated. The man who walked out of Anamosa State Penitentiary in 1970 was, if anything, more dangerous than the one who had entered, having learned new skills in manipulation and deception while harboring even greater resentment toward society. The period of John Wayne's incarceration and early release marked the end of his first adult incarnation as a successful businessman and community leader. The second phase of his adult life, which would begin with his return to Chicago, would see him apply the lessons he had learned from both his legitimate success and his criminal failure to create an even more effective facade of respectability. This new phase would also see the beginning of his career as a serial killer, as the psychological pressures that had driven him to sexual assault found new and more deadly forms of expression. The 18 months John Wayne spent in prison had provided him with valuable insights into the criminal justice system and the art of deception. He had learned that a convincing performance of remorse and rehabilitation could earn him significant benefits, while the underlying psychological problems that drove his criminal behavior could be successfully concealed from authorities. These lessons would serve him well as he prepared to embark on the most horrific phase of his criminal career. Upon his release from Anamosa State Penitentiary in June 1970, John Wayne Gacy returned to Chicago with the superficial appearance of a reformed man seeking to rebuild his life after a serious mistake. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade, he remained the same dangerous predator who had been incarcerated, with his fundamental psychological problems not only unresolved but potentially exacerbated by the experience of imprisonment and the complete collapse of his previous life. The return to Chicago represented both a homecoming and a fresh start for John Wayne. The city offered him opportunities to reinvent himself once again, drawing upon the skills he had developed in Iowa while incorporating the lessons he had learned from his criminal conviction and incarceration. The man who emerged from prison was more cautious, more sophisticated, and ultimately more dangerous than the one who had been sentenced in 1968. His reintegration into society began immediately, with John Wayne demonstrating the same energy and determination that had characterized his earlier business success. However, his status as a convicted sex offender limited his options and required him to be more creative in his approach to rebuilding his reputation and establishing new sources of income and social connection. In 1971, while still adjusting to life after prison, John Wayne faced new legal troubles when he was arrested for sexual assault on 2 separate occasions. These incidents demonstrated that his incarceration had done nothing to address the underlying psychological problems that drove his criminal behavior. If anything, his willingness to risk rearrest so soon after his release suggested that his compulsions had become even stronger and more difficult to control. The charges from these 1971 incidents were eventually dropped, possibly due to insufficient evidence or reluctant victims who preferred not to endure the trauma and publicity of a trial. This early victory in avoiding consequences for his continued criminal behavior likely reinforced John Wayne's belief that he could operate with impunity, setting the stage for the escalation that would soon follow. During this period of legal troubles and readjustment, John Wayne received crucial assistance from his mother, Marion Gacy, who helped him purchase a home at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, an unincorporated area just outside Chicago. This house would become the epicenter of his criminal activities and the burial ground for most of his victims. The purchase of this property represented a significant step in John Wayne's reinvention, providing him with a base of operations that would support both his legitimate business activities and his murderous crimes. The house on Somerdale Avenue was a typical ranch-style home in a middle-class neighborhood, offering John Wayne the respectable suburban address he needed to rebuild his public image. More importantly, from a criminal perspective, the house featured a large crawl space beneath the main floor that would prove ideal for concealing bodies. While there is no evidence that John Wayne selected the property with murder in mind, the physical characteristics of the house would prove perfectly suited to his future crimes. John Wayne's reintegration into his new community was remarkably successful, demonstrating his considerable skills in impression management and social manipulation. Despite his status as a convicted sex offender, he quickly established himself as a popular and respected neighbor, hosting elaborate summer parties that became legendary in the area. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They established his credentials as a fun-loving and generous community member. They provided him with opportunities to scout potential victims, and they created a public persona so positive that few would suspect him of serious criminal activity. The parties at the Somerdale Avenue house became famous throughout the neighborhood for their scale and extravagance. John Wayne spared no expense in entertaining his guests, providing abundant food, alcohol, and entertainment that created an atmosphere of celebration and excess. These events attracted dozens of guests and served as powerful demonstrations of his hospitality, generosity, and social skills. However, the parties also served darker purposes that were not apparent to his guests. They provided John Wayne with opportunities to observe potential victims, to test his ability to manipulate and control others, and to gauge how much suspicious behavior his neighbors would tolerate before becoming concerned. The elaborate nature of these gatherings also served to establish his financial resources and social connections, making him appear to be a successful and respectable member of the community. During this period, John Wayne also began his involvement in what would become one of his most famous alter egos, Pogo the Clown. His performances as a clown at various community events and children's parties would later earn him the nickname Killer Clown and provide one of the most chilling aspects of his public persona. The transformation into Pogo allowed him to interact with children and young people in a socially approved manner, while also satisfying his psychological need for attention and performance. The choice to become a clown performer was psychologically significant for several reasons. It provided him with a legitimate excuse to approach and interact with young people who might otherwise be wary of adult strangers. It satisfied his narcissistic need for attention and admiration, as his clown performances were generally well received by audiences. It also allowed him to explore themes of disguise and deception that would prove central to his criminal activities. The creation of the Pogo persona represented a sophisticated form of camouflage that allowed John Wayne to hide his predatory nature behind a facade of childlike innocence and entertainment. The bright costume, elaborate makeup, and exaggerated gestures of his clown character created a visual representation of harmlessness that was the perfect opposite of his true nature. This calculated deception would prove highly effective in disarming both potential victims and suspicious observers. In 1972, John Wayne married Carol Hoff, a former high school classmate who had since been divorced. This second marriage represented another attempt to establish conventional respectability and to provide himself with additional social cover for his criminal activities. Carol brought 2 young daughters from her previous marriage into the household, creating an instant family that further enhanced John Wayne's public image as a devoted family man. The marriage to Carol also provided John Wayne with additional opportunities to interact with young people, as her daughters and their friends became regular visitors to the Somerdale Avenue house. While there is no evidence that he harmed Carol's daughters, their presence in his household created numerous opportunities for him to study and interact with potential victims while maintaining his facade of respectability. The year 1972 also marked the beginning of John Wayne's career as a serial killer, though this fact would not become apparent until many years later. His first known murder occurred on January 3, 1972, when he killed 16-year-old Timothy McCoy, a teenager he encountered at the Greyhound bus station in Chicago. This murder marked a crucial escalation from sexual assault to homicide, crossing a line that would become easier to cross with each subsequent victim. The murder of Timothy McCoy established the pattern that would characterize most of John Wayne's subsequent crimes. He approached a vulnerable young person in a public place, used his considerable charm and apparent respectability to gain their trust, and lured them to his house under false pretenses. Once he had his victim isolated and under his control, he would subject them to sexual assault, torture, and ultimately murder. The choice of Timothy McCoy as his first victim was highly significant. The teenager was traveling alone, making him an ideal target from a predatory perspective. He was male, satisfying John Wayne's sexual preferences, and he was young and vulnerable, appealing to his need for dominance and control. The fact that Timothy was from out of state also reduced the likelihood that his disappearance would trigger an intensive local investigation. The murder method used on Timothy McCoy was also significant. Unlike his later victims, who would typically be strangled or asphyxiated, Timothy was stabbed to death. This difference in methodology suggests that John Wayne had not yet developed the ritualistic aspects of his killing that would characterize his later crimes. The stabbing may have been impulsive or the result of the victim's resistance, rather than part of a planned torture and murder scenario. Following the murder, John Wayne buried Timothy's body in the crawl space beneath his house, establishing the pattern of body disposal that would characterize most of his subsequent crimes. The crawl space provided an ideal location for concealing bodies, being both easily accessible from inside the house and completely hidden from outside observation. The decision to bury his victims on his own property demonstrated both his arrogance and his confidence in his ability to avoid detection. The successful completion of his first murder without detection likely provided John Wayne with enormous psychological satisfaction and reinforcement. He had successfully planned and executed the ultimate crime of power and control, disposing of the evidence in a way that seemed to ensure his safety from prosecution. This success would encourage him to continue killing, while also providing him with confidence in his methods and his ability to avoid consequences. The period immediately following Timothy McCoy's murder saw John Wayne continuing to develop his public persona and legitimate business activities. In 1974, he founded PDM Contractors, the letters reportedly standing for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance, a construction company that would become highly successful and provide him with both financial resources and a convenient source of potential victims. PDM Contractors served multiple functions in John Wayne's overall criminal enterprise. It provided him with legitimate income and business credentials that enhanced his public respectability. It gave him access to a steady stream of young male employees who could serve as potential victims. It provided him with the physical tools and knowledge necessary for body disposal, including lime for accelerating decomposition and construction equipment for digging burial sites. The success of PDM Contractors was remarkable, with the company quickly establishing itself as a reputable and profitable operation in the competitive Chicago construction market. John Wayne's business acumen, developed during his earlier success with the KFC franchises, served him well in building and managing his construction company. The legitimate success of PDM also provided him with additional social connections and business relationships that further enhanced his public image. However, the most sinister aspect of PDM Contractors was its role as a hunting ground for victims. Many of John Wayne's employees were young men, often runaways or individuals from troubled backgrounds who were grateful for steady employment and a chance to earn decent wages. These vulnerable young men were ideal targets for his predatory behavior, being both accessible and unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. John Wayne's relationship with his employees was complex and manipulative, characterized by a combination of genuine mentorship and sinister exploitation. He could be genuinely helpful to young men who were struggling to establish themselves, providing them with employment, training, and even housing. However, this generosity always came with a price, and employees who accepted his help often found themselves trapped in increasingly compromising situations. The construction business also provided John Wayne with practical knowledge and resources that would prove invaluable in his criminal activities. He learned about excavation, soil composition, and the use of lime and other chemicals in construction processes. This knowledge would later inform his methods of body disposal and his efforts to minimize the odor and evidence associated with decomposing corpses. As PDM Contractors grew and prospered, John Wayne's public profile continued to rise. He became known as a successful businessman who provided employment opportunities for young people and contributed to community development projects. This reputation served as powerful protection against suspicion, making it difficult for anyone to believe that such a respected community figure could be capable of serious criminal activity. The combination of his construction business, his community activities, and his performances as Pogo the Clown created an extremely convincing facade of respectability and civic-mindedness. John Wayne had successfully transformed himself from a convicted sex offender into an apparently exemplary citizen, demonstrating his remarkable abilities in deception and impression management. However, beneath this carefully constructed public image, his criminal activities were escalating steadily. The psychological satisfaction he had derived from his first murder was driving him to seek additional victims, while his growing confidence in his methods was making him increasingly bold in his predatory behavior. The foundation was being laid for what would become one of the most prolific serial killing sprees in American history. The success of his legitimate activities was providing him with the resources, connections, and reputation necessary to operate as a serial killer with minimal risk of detection. His house on Somerdale Avenue was becoming a tomb for his victims, while his construction company was providing him with both victims and the means to dispose of their bodies. The stage was set for the horrific crimes that would soon make John Wayne Gacy one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. The mid-1970s marked the beginning of John Wayne Gacy's most prolific period as a serial killer, during which his carefully constructed facade of respectability provided perfect cover for an escalating campaign of torture and murder. The psychological and practical foundations he had established during his early years in Chicago now supported a systematic pattern of predation that would claim dozens of lives before finally being exposed. By 1974, John Wayne had successfully established himself as a pillar of his community, with his construction business thriving and his reputation as a generous host and civic-minded citizen firmly entrenched. The elaborate summer parties at his Somerdale Avenue home had become legendary events that drew guests from throughout the area, creating a powerful image of prosperity and social success that made him seem above suspicion for any serious wrongdoing. The success of PDM contractors provided John Wayne with multiple advantages in his criminal activities. The business gave him legitimate reasons to interact with young men seeking employment, many of whom were runaways or individuals from troubled backgrounds who were unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. The construction work also provided him with practical knowledge about excavation and body disposal, while the company vehicles and equipment gave him the means to transport victims and evidence without attracting attention. His employees at PDM were often vulnerable young men who were grateful for steady work and decent wages. John Wayne cultivated a reputation as a generous employer who was willing to give chances to people others might reject. This reputation made him attractive to exactly the kind of individuals who would make ideal victims: young, isolated, and dependent on his goodwill for their economic survival. The relationship between John Wayne and his employees was complex and often inappropriate, characterized by his tendency to blur professional and personal boundaries. He frequently invited employees to live at his house, ostensibly to provide them with affordable housing while they established themselves financially. However, these living arrangements created opportunities for manipulation and abuse that he was quick to exploit. Several of his employees, including David Cram and Michael Rossi, became long-term residents of the Somerdale Avenue house, developing relationships with their employer that extended far beyond normal professional boundaries. These young men found themselves caught in increasingly compromising situations, subjected to sexual advances and manipulative behavior that they felt unable to resist due to their economic dependence on John Wayne. The sexual exploitation of his employees represented a significant escalation from his earlier pattern of random predation. Rather than hunting for victims in public places, John Wayne was now creating a controlled environment where potential victims came to him voluntarily and remained available for extended periods. This evolution in his methodology demonstrated both his growing sophistication as a predator and his increasing confidence in his ability to manipulate and control others. The most sinister aspect of the employee relationships was the way John Wayne used them to facilitate his murders. Young men like Cram and Rossi were compelled to dig what they were told were trenches for plumbing or drainage purposes in the crawl space beneath the house. In reality, they were digging graves for John Wayne's victims, unknowingly participating in the disposal of evidence from his crimes. The psychological manipulation required to convince employees to perform such tasks without understanding their true purpose demonstrated the depth of John Wayne's skill in deception and control. He was able to present plausible explanations for activities that should have raised serious suspicions, while creating an atmosphere of fear and dependency that prevented his employees from questioning his instructions too closely. The use of lime in the crawl space was explained to employees as a method for controlling moisture and odors associated with plumbing problems. In reality, John Wayne was using lime to accelerate the decomposition of buried bodies and reduce the telltale odors that might otherwise have attracted attention. This calculated use of chemical agents demonstrated both his practical knowledge of body disposal and his systematic approach to concealing evidence. Despite these precautions, the smell emanating from the crawl space became increasingly difficult to conceal as the number of buried bodies grew. Neighbors began to complain about odors coming from the property, and even guests at John Wayne's famous parties sometimes commented on unusual smells. However, his explanations about plumbing problems and moisture issues were generally accepted without serious investigation. The willingness of his community to accept these explanations reflected both the power of his carefully constructed reputation and the reluctance of people to believe that someone they knew and trusted could be capable of such horrific crimes. The cognitive dissonance created by suspecting a respected neighbor and community figure of serial murder was too great for most people to overcome without overwhelming evidence. John Wayne's marriage to Carol Hoff during this period provided him with additional social cover and reinforced his image as a conventional family man. However, the marriage was troubled from the beginning by Carol's growing awareness of her husband's unusual behavior and inappropriate relationships with young men. She discovered pornographic magazines featuring males hidden in their house and became increasingly suspicious of his frequent late nights and the parade of young men who visited their home. The tension in John Wayne's marriage reflected the increasing difficulty of maintaining his facade as his criminal activities intensified. The psychological strain of living a double life, combined with the practical challenges of concealing evidence and managing his complex web of deceptions, began to take a toll on his ability to maintain normal relationships and social functioning. Carol's suspicions about her husband's sexual orientation and inappropriate behavior with young men created additional pressure on John Wayne to maintain his carefully constructed image. He worked harder to present himself as a devoted husband and stepfather, while simultaneously escalating his predatory activities in ways that made detection increasingly likely. The period from 1975 to 1976 saw a dramatic acceleration in John Wayne's killing spree, with multiple victims disappearing over relatively short periods. The exact chronology of these murders remains uncertain due to the decomposition of bodies and John Wayne's inconsistent statements about his crimes. However, it is clear that he had developed a systematic approach to identifying, luring, and disposing of victims that allowed him to kill with increasing frequency. His typical pattern involved approaching potential victims in areas where young men congregated, particularly around the uptown neighborhood of Chicago where many runaways and street youth could be found. He would present himself as a successful businessman offering employment opportunities or temporary assistance, using his legitimate credentials and respectable appearance to overcome their natural wariness of strangers. Once he had gained a potential victim's trust, John Wayne would invite them to his house, often under the pretense of discussing employment opportunities or providing a place to stay for the night. The suburban location and conventional appearance of his home reinforced the impression that he was a legitimate and trustworthy individual, making victims more likely to accompany him willingly. The isolation of victims at his house created opportunities for John Wayne to reveal his true nature gradually, escalating from friendly conversation to sexual advances to outright assault and murder. The transformation from helpful benefactor to sadistic killer often occurred over a period of hours, during which victims found themselves trapped in an increasingly desperate situation with no means of escape. The magic trick involving handcuffs became a central element of John Wayne's methodology, providing him with a way to restrain victims while maintaining the pretense that their situation was part of a game or entertainment. Once victims were handcuffed, they were completely at his mercy, and could be subjected to whatever torture and abuse he desired without fear of resistance or escape. The sexual assault and torture that preceded murder satisfied multiple psychological needs for John Wayne. The complete domination of another person provided him with the sense of power and control that he had craved since his abused childhood. The sexual component satisfied his physical desires, while simultaneously allowing him to express his anger and hatred toward the demographic group that reminded him of his own vulnerabilities. The torture inflicted on his victims also served as a form of displaced revenge against his abusive father and the other authority figures who had harmed him throughout his life. By victimizing young men who resembled his younger self, John Wayne was symbolically destroying the weak and vulnerable aspects of his own personality that he had learned to despise. The method of murder, typically strangulation or asphyxiation, was chosen to minimize noise and avoid the mess associated with more violent killing methods. The quiet nature of these deaths allowed John Wayne to kill without alerting neighbors or attracting attention, while also providing him with the intimate physical contact that satisfied his need for complete dominance over his victims. The burial of bodies in the crawl space beneath his house represented the ultimate expression of John Wayne's arrogance and sense of invulnerability. Rather than disposing of bodies in remote locations where they might never be found, he chose to keep them close to him, literally living above the evidence of his crimes. This decision reflected both his confidence in his ability to avoid detection and his psychological need to maintain control over his victims even after death. The systematic nature of the burial process demonstrated John Wayne's evolution from an impulsive killer to a methodical one. He developed efficient procedures for digging graves, disposing of bodies, and concealing evidence that allowed him to maintain his killing schedule without being overwhelmed by the practical challenges of body disposal. The use of lime and other chemicals to accelerate decomposition and control odors showed his understanding of the scientific aspects of body disposal. However, the increasing number of bodies and the limited space available in the crawl space eventually made it impossible to completely control the smells and other evidence of his crimes. By early 1976, the strain of maintaining his double life was beginning to show in various aspects of John Wayne's behavior and relationships. His marriage to Carol was deteriorating under the weight of her suspicions and his increasingly erratic behavior. His business relationships were becoming more complex as he balanced legitimate operations with his need to identify and access potential victims. The psychological toll of his crimes was also becoming apparent in his increasing grandiosity and paranoia. The success of his killing spree had fed his narcissistic belief in his own superiority and invulnerability, while the constant need to maintain his facade and avoid detection was creating persistent anxiety and hypervigilance. The divorce from Carol in March 1976 marked a significant turning point in John Wayne's criminal career. The end of his marriage removed one of the last restraints on his behavior and eliminated a potential witness to his activities. Living alone in his house with a growing number of bodies beneath it, he was now free to accelerate his killing without concern for maintaining appearances within his household. The period following his divorce saw the most intense phase of John Wayne's killing spree, with victims disappearing at an unprecedented rate. The absence of Carol and her daughters from the house removed the need for him to moderate his behavior or explain the increasingly obvious signs of his criminal activities. The parties and gatherings that continued to be held at the house now served primarily as hunting grounds for victims rather than efforts to maintain his social connections. The escalation in killing frequency was accompanied by increasing recklessness in his methods and body disposal. The crawl space beneath the house was becoming overcrowded, forcing him to stack bodies and use every available space for burial. The lime and other chemicals he used to control decomposition were becoming less effective as the sheer number of bodies overwhelmed his disposal system. The smell emanating from the house became increasingly difficult to explain away, even to his most trusting neighbors and friends. The elaborate explanations about plumbing problems and moisture issues that had once satisfied curious observers were becoming less convincing as the odors became more persistent and obviously associated with organic decay. Despite these warning signs, John Wayne continued to believe in his invulnerability and his ability to avoid detection. The success he had achieved in maintaining his double life for several years had convinced him that he was too clever and too well respected to be caught. This hubris would ultimately prove to be his downfall, as his confidence led him to take increasingly dangerous risks that would finally expose his crimes to the world. The period from 1976 to 1978 represented the apex of John Wayne Gacy's criminal career, during which he perfected his methods of predation while maintaining the elaborate facade that protected him from suspicion. However, this same period also saw the gradual accumulation of evidence and warning signs that would eventually lead to his exposure and arrest. The killer, who had successfully operated in plain sight for years, was about to discover that even the most carefully constructed deception has its limits. As John Wayne Gacy entered the final phase of his killing spree in 1977 and 1978, the carefully balanced system that had allowed him to murder with impunity for years began to show signs of strain. The sheer volume of his crimes was creating practical and logistical challenges that even his considerable skills in deception and manipulation could no longer fully address. The crawl space beneath his Somerdale Avenue home had become so crowded with bodies that finding space for new victims required increasingly creative solutions. The overcrowding problem in his makeshift cemetery forced John Wayne to modify his burial practices in ways that increased his risk of detection. Bodies had to be stacked on top of one another in some areas, while others were buried in shallow graves that barely concealed them from view. The lime he used to accelerate decomposition and control odors was becoming less effective as the concentration of organic matter overwhelmed his chemical countermeasures. The smell emanating from the property had become so pronounced that it could no longer be dismissed as a minor plumbing problem or moisture issue. Neighbors were complaining with increasing frequency about the horrible odors coming from the direction of John Wayne's house, and even he was forced to acknowledge that the situation was becoming untenable. His standard explanations about sewer problems and the need for plumbing repairs were wearing thin, and more people were beginning to ask pointed questions about the source of the persistent stench. The practical challenges of body disposal eventually forced John Wayne to abandon his practice of burying all victims on his property. The crawl space had reached capacity, and the risks associated with digging new graves had become too great. This crisis led to a significant change in his methodology. He began disposing of bodies in the Des Plaines River, throwing them from the I-55 bridge south of Chicago, where the current would carry them away from any immediate connection to his activities. The decision to dispose of bodies in the river represented both a practical solution to his space problems and an escalation in the boldness of his criminal activities. Transporting corpses to the disposal site created new risks of detection, while the possibility that bodies might be recovered and identified posed threats that had not existed when all victims were buried on his property. However, the immediate relief provided by this new disposal method allowed him to continue killing without interruption. The river disposals began in early 1978 and involved at least 4 victims, including his final victim, 15-year-old Robert Piest. The choice to dispose of these bodies in running water demonstrated John Wayne's understanding of forensic science and his awareness that bodies left in the elements would decompose more quickly and be more difficult to identify than those buried in controlled environments. During this same period, John Wayne's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous, reflecting the psychological toll of maintaining his deadly double life for so many years. The constant stress of concealing his crimes while maintaining his public persona was manifesting in paranoid thinking, grandiose delusions, and increasingly poor judgment in his criminal activities. His interactions with employees and potential victims became more openly predatory and less carefully disguised. Where he had once been subtle and patient in his approach to potential victims, he now often rushed the process, making sexual advances that alarmed targets and created witnesses to his inappropriate behavior. This change in methodology reflected both his growing confidence and his increasing desperation to satisfy his murderous compulsions. One of the most significant incidents during this period involved Jeffrey Rignall, a 26-year-old man whom John Wayne approached on March 21, 1978, while Rignall was walking to a gay bar in Rosemont, Illinois. This encounter would prove to be crucial in John Wayne's eventual downfall, as Rignall became one of the few people to survive a serious assault and live to provide detailed testimony about the experience. John Wayne lured Rignall into his car by offering him a ride and marijuana, using his standard approach of presenting himself as a friendly and helpful individual. However, once Rignall was in the vehicle, John Wayne held a chloroform-soaked rag over his face, rendering him unconscious and helpless. This use of chemical restraints represented an evolution in John Wayne's methodology, allowing him to quickly subdue victims without the need for physical violence that might attract attention. Rignall regained consciousness intermittently during the drive to John Wayne's house, managing to observe several landmarks that would later prove crucial in identifying his attacker. Once at the Somerdale Avenue address, he was subjected to hours of sexual assault, torture, and psychological abuse that mirrored the treatment John Wayne had inflicted on his murder victims. The ordeal Rignall endured provided investigators with detailed insights into John Wayne's methods and psychology. He was restrained using a wooden torture device equipped with chains, while John Wayne stood naked before him with an array of sexual implements, describing in detail what he intended to do with each one. This sadistic ritual of explanation and anticipation was apparently a crucial element of John Wayne's psychological satisfaction, allowing him to savor his victims' terror and helplessness. During the assault, Rignall reported seeing another man in the room, suggesting that John Wayne may have had accomplices or witnesses to at least some of his crimes. This detail would later fuel speculation about whether he had operated alone throughout his criminal career or whether others had been involved in his activities. The decision to release Rignall alive rather than killing him remains one of the most puzzling aspects of John Wayne's criminal behavior. Unlike his other known victims, Rignall was allowed to survive, being dumped unconscious in Lincoln Park, where he was found the next morning by joggers. The reasons for this deviation from his usual pattern of murder may never be fully understood, but it proved to be a crucial mistake that provided law enforcement with their first detailed description of his methods and location. Rignall's survival and subsequent report to police represented the first serious threat to John Wayne's carefully constructed facade. However, the initial response to Rignall's allegations was disappointingly inadequate, reflecting both the homophobic attitudes of the era and the difficulties inherent in investigating crimes against marginalized populations. When Rignall reported the assault to Chicago police, his account was met with skepticism and apparent indifference. The investigators seemed more concerned with his sexual orientation and his presence in a gay bar than with the serious crimes he was reporting. This dismissive attitude reflected the social prejudices of the time and contributed to John Wayne's ability to continue operating with impunity. Frustrated by the police response, Rignall took it upon himself to identify his attacker, spending months staking out highway exit ramps and overpasses in the area where he had been abducted. His persistence eventually paid off when he spotted John Wayne's distinctive black Oldsmobile and followed it to the Somerdale Avenue address. This citizen investigation provided police with the crucial information they needed to identify John Wayne as a suspect, though they were slow to act on this intelligence. The formal charges that were eventually filed against John Wayne for the assault on Rignall were relatively minor, and he was allowed to remain free on bond while the case proceeded through the court system. This lenient treatment reflected both the judicial system's underestimation of the danger he posed and the social attitudes that minimized crimes against gay men. The failure to take Rignall's case seriously represented a missed opportunity that cost additional lives. Between the time Rignall's charges were filed and John Wayne's eventual arrest for murder, he killed at least 4 more victims, including Robert Piest. This tragic toll could have been prevented if law enforcement had taken Rignall's allegations seriously and conducted a thorough investigation of John Wayne's activities. The institutional failures that allowed him to continue killing demonstrated the deadly consequences of prejudice and indifference within the criminal justice system. The increasing frequency of John Wayne's crimes during 1978 reflected both his growing psychological compulsion to kill and his confidence that he could continue to evade detection. The successful disposal of bodies in the Des Plaines River had solved his immediate space problems, while his continued reputation as a respected businessman and community figure provided ongoing protection from serious scrutiny. However, the very success of his criminal activities was also contributing to his eventual downfall. The large number of missing persons cases in the Chicago area had begun to attract attention from investigators who were looking for patterns and connections. The concentration of disappearances among young men from specific demographic groups was creating a statistical anomaly that suggested the involvement of a serial predator. John Wayne's confidence in his invulnerability was also leading him to take increasingly dangerous risks in his selection and approach to potential victims. Where he had once been careful to target only the most vulnerable and isolated individuals, He was now approaching victims who had stronger community connections and whose disappearances were more likely to trigger intensive investigations. The case that would finally expose John Wayne's crimes began on December 11, 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared after telling his mother he was going to meet someone about a high-paying construction job. Pius was significantly different from John Wayne's typical victims in several crucial ways. He was younger than most, he had strong family connections, and he had told people where he was going and whom he was meeting. Pius had encountered John Wayne at Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, where the teenager worked part-time while attending high school. John Wayne had been at the pharmacy on business related to a remodeling project when he overheard Pius complaining to a coworker about his low wages. Seeing an opportunity, John Wayne approached the boy and offered him a job with PDM contractors that would pay significantly more than his current position. The conversation between John Wayne and Pius was witnessed by several people at the pharmacy, creating a clear connection between them that had not existed with his previous victims. When Pius told his mother he was going to meet someone about a job and then failed to return home, his family immediately contacted police with a description of the encounter and the man who had approached their son. The Des Plaines Police Department's investigation into Pius' disappearance began immediately and was far more thorough than the investigations that had followed the disappearances of John Wayne's previous victims. The combination of Pius' young age, his strong family connections, and the witness testimony linking him to a specific individual created a level of urgency and focus that had been lacking in earlier cases. The investigation quickly identified John Wayne as the last person known to have had contact with Pius, leading to his first interview with police on December 12, 1978, just one day after the teenager's disappearance. During this initial interview, John Wayne denied having any contact with Pius and claimed to have been at home during the time period in question. However, his nervous demeanor and inconsistent statements raised suspicions among the investigating officers. The decision to place John Wayne under surveillance represented a crucial turning point in the investigation. Unlike previous cases where suspects had been questioned and released without further monitoring, the Des Plaines police maintained continuous observation of his activities while they gathered additional evidence. This surveillance would ultimately provide investigators with the evidence they needed to obtain search warrants and make arrests. The surveillance operation revealed several suspicious patterns in John Wayne's behavior that reinforced investigators' suspicions about his involvement in Pius' disappearance. He was observed making multiple trips to the Des Plaines River, the same location where he had been disposing of recent victims. He also engaged in behavior suggesting that he was destroying evidence, including burning materials in his backyard and making unusual purchases of cleaning supplies and lime. On December 13, 1978, just 2 days after Pius' disappearance, investigators obtained their first search warrant for John Wayne's residence. The search was initially limited in scope, focusing primarily on finding evidence related to Pius' disappearance rather than investigating broader criminal activity. However, what they discovered during this initial search would lead to one of the most shocking crime scene investigations in American history. The search of John Wayne's house revealed several items that immediately raised serious concerns about his involvement in criminal activity. Investigators found identification cards and personal belongings belonging to several missing persons, suggesting that Pius might not have been his only victim. They also discovered a significant amount of lime, which John Wayne claimed was for construction purposes, but which investigators suspected might have more sinister applications. Most ominously, the search revealed that certain areas of the house, particularly around the crawl space, emitted strong odors that investigators recognized as consistent with human decomposition. The combination of the suspicious odors, the lime, and the personal belongings of missing persons created probable cause for a more extensive investigation that would ultimately expose the full extent of John Wayne's crimes. The decision to expand the search to include the crawl space beneath the house was made on December 21, 1978, 10 days after Pius' initial disappearance. This decision would transform what had begun as a missing person investigation into one of the largest homicide investigations in American history, ultimately revealing evidence of at least 33 murders committed over a period of 6 years. The discovery of human remains in the crawl space confirmed investigators' worst suspicions and marked the beginning of the end for John Wayne Gacy's criminal career. The man who had successfully maintained his deadly double life for years was finally exposed, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling in the face of overwhelming physical evidence of his crimes. The investigation that followed would reveal the true scope of John Wayne's activities and provide some measure of justice for his victims and their families. However, the delayed recognition of the pattern of his crimes and the missed opportunities for earlier intervention had allowed him to claim far more victims than should have been possible. The case would become a landmark in the study of serial murder and would prompt significant changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate missing persons cases and coordinate efforts to identify serial predators. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy on December 21, 1978, marked the culmination of one of the most intensive criminal investigations in Chicago history and the beginning of a legal process that would captivate the nation's attention for years to come. The discovery of human remains at his Somerdale Avenue residence had transformed what began as a missing person case into a mass murder investigation of unprecedented scope and complexity. The excavation of John Wayne's property began immediately following his arrest and continued for weeks as investigators painstakingly recovered and cataloged the remains of his victims. The process was both technically challenging and emotionally devastating for the officers and forensic experts involved, many of whom would later describe the experience as the most difficult of their careers. The crawl space beneath John Wayne's house yielded 26 bodies in various states of decomposition, some buried individually and others stacked on top of one another in makeshift graves. The confined space made recovery extremely difficult, requiring investigators to work in hazmat suits while enduring the overwhelming stench of decomposition that had accumulated over years of use as an impromptu cemetery. 3 additional bodies were found buried elsewhere on the property, one in the backyard and one beneath the garage floor, with a third located near the house's foundation. The systematic search of the entire property revealed the extent to which John Wayne had used his residential lot as a disposal site for his victims, turning what appeared to be an ordinary suburban home into a mass grave. The condition of the remains made identification extremely challenging, with many bodies reduced to skeletal remains that provided few clues about the victims' identities or the circumstances of their deaths. The advanced state of decomposition also made it difficult to determine exact causes of death, though investigators were able to identify evidence consistent with strangulation and asphyxiation in several cases. The recovery process was complicated by John Wayne's use of lime and other chemicals intended to accelerate decomposition and control odors. While these substances had served their intended purpose to some extent, they had also compromised the integrity of physical evidence and made the work of forensic investigators more difficult. The chemical contamination of the remains created additional challenges in determining both the identities of victims and the methods used to kill them. As the scope of the crime scene became apparent, law enforcement agencies from throughout the Chicago area converged on the Somerdale Avenue address to assist with the investigation. The Illinois State Police, the Cook County Sheriff's Department, and multiple local police departments contributed personnel and resources to what had become one of the largest criminal investigations in state history. The media attention surrounding the discovery was intense and immediate, with reporters and television crews establishing a permanent presence outside John Wayne's house as the excavation proceeded. The horrific nature of the crimes, combined with John Wayne's reputation as a respected businessman and community figure, created a story that captured international attention and dominated news coverage for weeks. The investigation also extended beyond the physical recovery of remains to include efforts to identify the victims and understand the full scope of John Wayne's criminal activities. Detectives began the painstaking process of matching the recovered remains with missing person reports from throughout the region, while also investigating whether John Wayne might have committed additional crimes that had not yet been discovered. The complexity of the victim identification process was enormous, involving dental records, medical records, personal effects, and DNA analysis in cases where other methods proved insufficient. Many of the victims had been young men from troubled backgrounds who had limited contact with family members, making identification particularly challenging and time-consuming. The investigation also revealed the extent to which John Wayne had manipulated and exploited his employees, with several young men coming forward to describe inappropriate sexual behavior and coercive relationships that had made them uncomfortable, but which they had been afraid to report. These revelations provided important insights into John Wayne's methodology and helped investigators understand how he had been able to identify and access potential victims. The discovery that several of John Wayne's employees had unknowingly participated in digging graves for his victims created additional complications for the investigation. Young men like David Cram and Michael Rossi had to be interviewed extensively to determine their level of knowledge about John Wayne's crimes and whether they might face criminal charges as accomplices. The interviews with employees revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation John Wayne had employed to maintain his criminal activities while avoiding detection. He had created plausible explanations for activities that should have raised serious suspicions, while establishing relationships of dependency and fear that discouraged his employees from questioning his instructions or reporting their concerns to authorities. The investigation also uncovered evidence of John Wayne's political connections and community involvement, revealing how he had used his public profile to deflect suspicion and gain access to potential victims. His photographs with prominent political figures, including First Lady Rosalind Carter, demonstrated the level of respectability he had achieved and the shock that his arrest created within political and social circles. The recovery of bodies from the Des Plaines River proved more challenging than the excavation of John Wayne's property, as the flowing water and natural decomposition processes had scattered remains and made identification even more difficult. However, investigators were eventually able to recover 4 bodies from the river, including that of Robert Piest, whose disappearance had triggered the entire investigation. The confession John Wayne provided to investigators on December 22, 1978, while comprehensive in some respects, was also characterized by numerous contradictions, omissions, and outright lies that complicated efforts to understand the full extent of his crimes. His tendency to provide different versions of events in different interviews, combined with his apparent inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality in some areas, made his statements unreliable as evidence. During his confession, John Wayne claimed that all of his victims had entered his house willingly and that many of the deaths had been accidental or the result of self-defense. These claims were contradicted by the physical evidence and the testimony of survivors like Jeffrey Rignall, who provided detailed accounts of premeditated torture and murder that belied any suggestion of accidental death. The confession also revealed John Wayne's complete lack of empathy for his victims and their families, as he described the murders in clinical terms while showing no apparent remorse for his actions. His primary concern seemed to be minimizing his legal exposure rather than accepting responsibility for the harm he had caused or providing information that might help investigators identify additional victims. The legal proceedings that followed John Wayne's arrest were complicated by both the sheer volume of charges against him and the unprecedented nature of the case. He was ultimately charged with 33 counts of murder, making him responsible for more homicides than any single perpetrator in American legal history at that time. The decision to seek the death penalty was made relatively quickly given the heinous nature of the crimes and the number of victims involved. However, the complexity of the case and the volume of evidence that needed to be processed meant that the trial would not begin until February 1980, more than a year after John Wayne's arrest. The pretrial period was marked by extensive legal maneuvering as both the prosecution and defense prepared their cases. The defense team's decision to pursue an insanity defense required extensive psychiatric evaluation and created additional delays in the proceedings. The prosecution, meanwhile, worked to organize the massive amount of physical evidence and witness testimony that would be needed to secure convictions. The psychiatric evaluations conducted during this period provided important insights into John Wayne's mental state and psychological makeup, though they also generated considerable controversy about his competency to stand trial and his legal responsibility for his actions. The defense argued that his childhood trauma and apparent mental illness had rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongness of his actions or controlling his behavior. The prosecution countered that John Wayne's elaborate efforts to conceal his crimes and maintain his public facade demonstrated clear awareness that his actions were wrong and punishable by law. They argued that his ability to successfully operate his business and maintain social relationships proved that he was competent and legally responsible for his actions, regardless of any underlying mental health issues. The venue for the trial became a contentious issue due to the extensive media coverage and public awareness of the case. The defense requested a change of venue, arguing that the intense publicity made it impossible for John Wayne to receive a fair trial in Cook County. However, The judge ultimately decided to proceed with the trial in Cook County while implementing special procedures to ensure that jurors were selected from outside the immediate area. The jury selection process was complex and time-consuming, with prospective jurors being brought in from Winnebago County, about 90 miles from Chicago, to minimize the impact of local publicity on their ability to render an impartial verdict. This marked the first time in Illinois history that a jury had been impaneled in this manner, reflecting the unprecedented nature of the case and the challenges it presented to the judicial system. The trial itself began in February 1980 and lasted for several weeks, with the prosecution presenting extensive evidence about John Wayne's crimes and the defense arguing that he was legally insane at the time the murders were committed. The proceedings were marked by graphic testimony about the torture and murder of the victims, as well as detailed psychiatric testimony about John Wayne's mental state and criminal responsibility. The evidence presented during the trial included crime scene photographs, forensic testimony about the victims' remains, and accounts from survivors and witnesses who could provide insights into John Wayne's methods and psychological state. The sheer volume of evidence and the horrific nature of the crimes created an emotionally charged atmosphere that made the trial one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in American history. The defense's insanity argument was ultimately unsuccessful, with the jury rejecting the claim that John Wayne's mental illness had rendered him unable to understand the wrongness of his actions or control his behavior. The jury's decision reflected both the strength of the prosecution's evidence and the community's desire to hold John Wayne fully accountable for his crimes regardless of any psychological factors that might have contributed to his behavior. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death for 12 of the murders, with additional sentences of natural life imprisonment for the remaining convictions. The death sentences reflected both the heinous nature of his crimes and the court's determination that he posed a continuing threat to public safety that could only be addressed through capital punishment. The sentencing marked the end of the trial phase of the proceedings, but the beginning of a lengthy appeals process that would continue for more than a decade. John Wayne's attorneys filed numerous appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentence, arguing that he had not received adequate legal representation and that his mental illness should have precluded the death penalty. The appeals process revealed additional details about John Wayne's crimes and provided victims' families with ongoing opportunities to seek justice for their loved ones. However, the lengthy legal proceedings also created additional emotional trauma for the survivors and families, who were forced to relive the horrific details of the crimes repeatedly as the case worked its way through the appellate courts. The case also prompted significant changes in law enforcement procedures for investigating missing persons cases and identifying serial predators. The recognition that John Wayne had been able to operate for years without detection led to improved coordination between police departments and the development of new techniques for recognizing patterns of criminal behavior across jurisdictional boundaries. The cultural impact of the John Wayne Gacy case was enormous, influencing everything from popular entertainment to academic studies of criminal behavior. The image of the killer clown became a powerful symbol of hidden evil, while the case itself became a landmark in the study of serial murder and the development of criminal profiling techniques. The long-term consequences of John Wayne's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families to include broader impacts on community trust, law enforcement practices, and public understanding of the potential for evil to hide behind facades of respectability and normalcy. The case served as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal and trustworthy to the outside world. The period between John Wayne Gacy's conviction and his eventual execution in 1994 was marked by a complex interplay of legal appeals, psychological evaluation, and cultural fascination that kept his case in the public eye for more than a decade. During his 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, John Wayne became an unlikely figure of public interest, generating correspondence, artwork, and ongoing media coverage that reflected society's continued fascination with his crimes and personality. One of the most controversial aspects of John Wayne's time in prison was his prolific artistic output, which began in 1982 when he acquired a set of paints and began creating what would eventually number over 2,000 individual works. His paintings, which featured a variety of subjects including clowns, Skulls, landscapes, and portraits of famous figures became valuable commodities in a macabre art market that specialized in works created by convicted killers. The subject matter of John Wayne's paintings was particularly disturbing given the nature of his crimes. Many canvases featured images of Pogo the Clown, the character he had portrayed at children's parties and community events during the height of his killing spree. These self-portraits as a clown took on sinister significance when viewed in the context of his crimes, transforming what had once been a symbol of innocent entertainment into an icon of hidden evil. Other paintings featured human skulls, often pierced by daggers or surrounded by dark imagery that seemed to reflect his continued preoccupation with death and violence. The creation of these works raised disturbing questions about whether John Wayne was attempting to relive or celebrate his crimes through his art, or whether the paintings represented some form of psychological processing of his experiences. The commercial success of John Wayne's artwork was controversial from the beginning, with victims' rights advocates arguing that allowing him to profit from his notoriety was inappropriate and harmful to the families of his victims. The concept of murderabilia, collectible items associated with notorious criminals, gained widespread attention through the marketing of John Wayne's paintings, raising ethical questions about society's fascination with criminal behavior. Several attempts were made to prevent John Wayne from profiting from his artwork, with Illinois filing suit in 1993 to block the sale of his paintings under laws designed to prevent criminals from benefiting financially from their crimes. However, these legal efforts were only partially successful, and many of his works continued to be sold to collectors willing to pay thousands of dollars for paintings created by one of America's most notorious serial killers. The prices commanded by John Wayne's artwork reflected both his notoriety and the morbid curiosity of collectors fascinated by criminal memorabilia. Individual paintings sold for amounts ranging from $2,000 to $20,000, with the most expensive pieces being those featuring his Pogo the Clown persona or other imagery directly related to his crimes. The psychological evaluation that continued throughout John Wayne's imprisonment provided ongoing insights into his mental state and personality, though it also generated continued controversy about his competency and responsibility for his crimes. Different mental health professionals reached varying conclusions about his psychological condition, with some arguing that he suffered from severe personality disorders that had contributed to his criminal behavior, while others maintained that he was a calculating psychopath who was fully responsible for his actions. One of the most significant aspects of John Wayne's psychological profile was his apparent inability to accept responsibility for his crimes or show genuine remorse for his victims. Throughout his years in prison, he maintained various versions of his innocence, sometimes claiming that his employees had committed the murders without his knowledge, other times suggesting that the deaths had been accidental or the result of self-defense. These continued denials and shifting explanations reflected both John Wayne's narcissistic personality traits and his persistent attempts to manipulate public opinion and legal proceedings in his favor. His inability to acknowledge the harm he had caused or express empathy for his victims was seen by many observers as evidence of the profound psychological damage that had made him capable of such horrific crimes. The appeals process that continued throughout John Wayne's imprisonment was exhaustive and complex, involving multiple challenges to various aspects of his conviction and sentence. His attorneys argued that he had not received adequate legal representation during his original trial, that his mental illness should have precluded the death penalty, and that various procedural errors had compromised the fairness of his conviction. Each appeal was met with detailed responses from prosecutors who argued that John Wayne had received fair treatment under the law and that his crimes were so heinous that they justified the death penalty regardless of any mitigating factors. The appellate courts consistently upheld his conviction and sentence, though the process took many years to complete due to the complexity of the issues involved and the thoroughness of the legal review. The lengthy appeals process created ongoing trauma for the families of John Wayne's victims, who were forced to relive the details of their loved ones' deaths repeatedly as each legal challenge was presented and argued. Many family members expressed frustration with the delays and the apparent endless nature of the legal proceedings, feeling that justice was being denied by the very system that was supposed to provide it. The media attention surrounding John Wayne's case continued throughout his imprisonment, with periodic reports about his appeals, his artwork, and his life in prison generating public interest and commentary. The case became a fixture in true crime literature and documentary programming, with numerous books, television specials, and films exploring different aspects of his crimes and psychology. This ongoing media coverage served to keep John Wayne's case in the public consciousness and contributed to his status as one of America's most notorious criminals. However, it also raised questions about the appropriateness of providing continued publicity to someone who had clearly craved attention and recognition throughout his life and criminal career. The cultural impact of the John Wayne Gacy case extended far beyond true crime entertainment to influence broader discussions about the nature of evil, the effectiveness of the criminal justice system, and the potential for seemingly normal individuals to harbor deadly secrets. His case became a touchstone for discussions about serial murder, psychological profiling, and the challenges of identifying and stopping predators who operate within their communities. The image of Pogo the Clown became particularly powerful in American popular culture, representing the concept of hidden evil and the danger that can lurk behind innocent appearances. The killer clown archetype that emerged from John Wayne's case influenced everything from horror movies to urban legends, creating a lasting cultural impact that continues to resonate decades after his crimes. Academic and professional interest in John Wayne's case also continued throughout his imprisonment, with researchers studying various aspects of his crimes and psychology to better understand serial murder and develop improved methods for prevention and detection. His case became a standard reference point in criminology textbooks and forensic psychology studies, contributing to the development of criminal profiling techniques and investigative procedures. The ongoing identification of John Wayne's victims remained a priority for law enforcement agencies throughout his imprisonment, with advances in DNA technology and genealogical databases gradually allowing investigators to put names to previously unidentified remains. Each new identification provided some measure of closure for families who had spent years wondering about the fate of their missing loved ones, while also serving to remind the public of the human cost of John Wayne's crimes. The process of victim identification was complicated by the passage of time and the condition of the remains, but dedicated investigators continued working to solve these cases long after John Wayne's arrest and conviction. The use of new technologies and investigative techniques eventually led to the identification of additional victims, bringing the total number of positively identified individuals to 28 by the time of John Wayne's execution. The 5 victims who remained unidentified at the time of John Wayne's death represented ongoing tragedies for families who never learned the fate of their missing loved ones. The continued efforts to identify these individuals reflected the commitment of law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy groups to provide closure for all families affected by John Wayne's crimes, regardless of how much time had passed. The international attention that John Wayne's case received also contributed to improved cooperation between law enforcement agencies and the development of better systems for tracking missing persons and identifying patterns of criminal behavior. His case demonstrated the importance of coordinating investigations across jurisdictional boundaries and sharing information that might help identify serial predators before they can claim additional victims. As John Wayne's execution date approached in 1994, the case once again generated intense media coverage and public debate about the appropriateness of capital punishment and the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. Supporters of his execution argued that his crimes were so heinous that the death penalty was the only appropriate punishment, while opponents raised questions about the ethics of state-sponsored execution and the possibility that mental illness should preclude capital punishment. The final years of John Wayne's imprisonment were marked by increasing recognition that his appeals had been exhausted and that his execution was inevitable. This realization seemed to have little impact on his psychological state or his continued efforts to maintain his innocence and avoid accepting responsibility for his crimes. He remained defiant and unrepentant until the end, showing no apparent remorse for his victims or their families. The preparation for John Wayne's execution involved extensive security measures and media management, as officials anticipated significant public interest in the proceedings. The execution was scheduled for May 10, 1994, exactly 26 years after his original arrest for sexual assault in Iowa, a coincidence that was noted by observers as a form of poetic justice. The method of execution, lethal injection, was chosen as the most humane and reliable means of carrying out the death sentence. However, the actual execution proved to be more complicated than anticipated, with technical problems causing delays and extending the process beyond its normal duration. The complications were seen by some as symbolic of the broader difficulties and controversies that had surrounded John Wayne's case from the beginning. John Wayne's final meal request reflected both his past and his personality, including items from Kentucky Fried Chicken, the restaurant chain where he had once worked as a manager. The meal consisted of a bucket of KFC chicken, 12 fried shrimp, French fries, a pound of strawberries, and a Diet Coke, representing a final indulgence in the pleasures of life before facing the consequences of his crimes. His final words, "Kiss my ass," delivered to the witnesses gathered for his execution, were characteristic of the defiant and unrepentant attitude he had maintained throughout his imprisonment. The crude and dismissive nature of this final statement provided a fitting end to a life that had been characterized by contempt for others and refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. The execution of John Wayne Gacy on May 10, 1994, marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history and provided some measure of closure for the families of his victims. However, the impact of his crimes continued to resonate long after his death, influencing law enforcement procedures, popular culture, and academic understanding of serial murder and criminal psychology. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of taking seriously reports of sexual assault and missing persons, particularly when they involve marginalized populations who may not receive adequate attention from law enforcement agencies. The delays and missed opportunities that allowed John Wayne to continue killing for years after his initial criminal conviction highlighted the deadly consequences of indifference and prejudice within the criminal justice system. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy remains complex and troubling more than 3 decades after his arrest. While his execution provided justice for his crimes, the broader questions raised by his case about the nature of evil, the effectiveness of rehabilitation, and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members continue to challenge our understanding of criminal behavior and our commitment to public safety. The story of John Wayne Gacy serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal and trustworthy, and that the facade of respectability can conceal unimaginable evil. His case continues to inform our understanding of serial murder and provides important lessons for law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, and society as a whole about the need for vigilance, compassion, and justice in the face of such horrific crimes. The systematic torture and murder of 33 young men and boys represents one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, and the memory of John Wayne Gacy's victims deserves to be honored not through fascination with their killer, but through commitment to preventing such tragedies from occurring again.